Good evening, everybody. A little bit later than normal because someone on this show wanted to watch women kick balls around on a grass field. But
Well, when
welcome
you put
back
it that
to
way, that's 100% accurate.
that's exactly what it was. So this is Two Guys, One Car, car podcast all about car stuff. And in today's topics, the first thing is we are going to do a live on-air taste test of the new and fancy Rich Energy Premium British Energy drink. Oh, I said that wrong. Premium Energy. You know what? I completely screwed up. Forget it. I was going to do a British accent and failed.
Shave your beard right now. You're a disgrace to the CEO.
He does have an amazing beard, and he has really curly hair too, right?
I believe he does, yes.
He does. So we'll be doing a live on-air taste test. Tom has a can. I have a can. We'll talk all about that in a minute. Then we're going to go into a much sadder topic. Lee Iacocca, the CEO, longtime CEO of Chrysler, and also for a time ran Ford. He passed away earlier, I guess it was about a week ago. So we'll talk about him, his legacy, and how is he still relevant today. Talk about Ford and layoffs. Seems to be a perennial topic is layoffs. The CEO of BMW is stepping down, or I think is being told to step down. And last topic is going to be Formula One in Austria, because that was just a wickedly good race, which is kind of rare in Formula One these days. So we're going to talk about that.
And also the NASCAR race that just ended, because that too had some interesting results.
Yeah, we can talk about that, because you got to balance out the right-hand heavy Austrian Red Bull ring with some left-handed turns at Daytona. So that'll be perfect. So let's start with the energy drink. So first of all, I want to note when we were recording, it is 7:34 p.m. and we're both about to drink some energy drinks. So this is probably going to be a terrible decision for our Monday mornings. But Rich Energy, so this is it's a bit of an interesting company. So the first thing is they are a competitor to Red Bull, both in the world of energy drinks and also in the world of energy drink marketing and Formula One. Also technically a competitor to Monster, because they also sponsor the Mercedes Formula One team.
And all of NASCAR. Well, the
Yep.
years.
Yeah, all in NASCAR. And they actually showed up at the Indy 500. I could have gotten a free can there and failed because I was busy working.
How dare you be professional?
So the first thing about this is their website says a premium British energy drink, and that is a direct quote. It's the first thing you see on their website. And right here at the top of the can, it says made in Austria, which coincidentally is exactly where Red Bull is made. So I guess Austria is a haven for energy drinks. Also, speaking of premium, in the US, it was supposed to only be sold in fancy clubs and stuff like that. And I bought this 6-pack at Walmart. And not just
Walmart.com.
Yeah, not even in a store. I ordered it. So the reason we were off air last week is because I was visiting my family for the 4th of July week. So I bought the 6-pack. I paid a grand total of $15 for all 6 of these cans, and I gave one of them to Tom. So that is how he has his. We did not individually buy 6-packs. They say they use only the finest ingredients, and I'll just list the first 5: water, sugar, glucose, acidulant citric acid, and carbonic acid, which is basically just orange juice without the orange.
And I want to list some of the last few here because those are interesting to me.
Those are the ones that they sprinkle in at the very end.
Coloring E150D. Stabilizer E414.
Niacin. That's a real thing, though.
Flavoring. All important flavoring. Yeah, the Stabilizer E414 is my favorite. That sounds like something the military uses.
Actually, I think what the military uses is pantothenic acid. I'm not sure for what, but it's probably not good. And there's vitamin B12 in there. We'll give them a little bit of credit for that.
It's literally the last ingredient, though.
It is.
And the first 2 are sugar. The second 2.
And the very first one is water, which you kind of expect because it is an energy drink.
It's a
There's
beverage, yes.
yeah. Um, so I guess one of the little bit of the backstory on Rich is they kind of came out of nowhere. It was sort of like one day they were nothing, and then the next day they were. First
Sponsoring
of
an
all,
F1 team.
well, no. First, they tried to buy an F1 team. They were one of the serious bidders for the formerly Force India F1 team, now known as Racing Point. And I think that the British court did a good job. The arbitration court chose wisely when they went with the guy who owns a fashion line as opposed to the guy who has an energy drink company that doesn't really sell a lot of energy drink.
Yes,
So now they
one
sponsor.
had product and the other did not.
Yeah, and it's funny because I remember when Rich, so their CEO went out everywhere. He would talk to anybody who listened and said, "We're a real company. We've got a ton of money. We've got a ton of product. We've got an amazing drink that everybody loves." And if you talk to the people in the UK where this is based, nobody could find it. It didn't exist. So for everybody thought it was vaporware for about 6 months, but again, it's real. This is a real can. It exists. There is drink inside. It's unopened. Um, so unlike some certain F1 sponsors like Moneytron, which is a wonderful story for another day, this actually exists as a product. So
And
I
we've got a piece
guess,
of history here with this logo.
yeah, because they just lost a trade lawsuit or a copyright lawsuit over the Staghorns logo because it looks identical to another company's logo. It's just a crazy bat poop ridiculous story, and it's just going to be one of those. It's funny now. It's going to be kind of sad later, and hopefully it doesn't ruin Haas F1 in the process. So, I guess it's time to do the taste test. Though I will add on this final note. In the most wonderful, I think, product slogan ever, Rich has gone with "Forget the wings. Rich energy gives you horns." So I expect that by drinking this, we're going to get horny. So,
And we're off the air.
all right.
All right.
Cheers. See you on the other side. British drink, so pinky out.
Label out too. I'm gonna put that off to the side and not drink that again. That's
It's actually,
in the
I gotta say, it's not bad.
in the pantheon of energy drinks, it's a round Monster. I don't think it's as bad as Monster, but it's really, really sweet.
Honestly,
As you could tell.
it tastes identical to Red Bull. I taste no difference between this and sugared Red Bull.
It's been so long since I've had sugared Red Bull that I don't even remember how it tastes. So I don't remember, but it tastes like candy. I don't need that from my caffeinated beverages.
I mean, a lot of energy drinks do. As you're right,
True.
Monster is very sugary.
It's better
Nos
than
is very
Monster.
sugary. I would say so. Amp is basically Mountain Dew with like 5 times the caffeine.
So you said you pointed out it's made in Austria and it tastes similar to Red Bull. If I grab my knife and started gnawing at this label, do you think there's a Red Bull label underneath?
No, but I'm really curious. I think I might buy a can of Red Bull tomorrow just to like compare the two identically. I do think this is definitely a different can, but it does not taste very different to Red Bull. So I'm gonna be honest. Like I was actually expecting this to be horrible because every single review I've seen has been, "Oh my god, it's the worst thing ever. I felt like I was dying." Like, grow up, people.
All right,
it's not bad, but it exists. So.
All right, I'm lifting the veil already. I opened this earlier today at 1 p.m. because I didn't want to drink an energy drink at 7:30, and I felt weird about 30 minutes after I had all of two sips just to try it. I did feel weird, probably because I haven't had that high of a sugar concentration in a really long time, or energy drinks for that matter.
Yeah,
I definitely felt alert.
If you couldn't tell, Tom is the healthy one of the two of us. He like actually takes care of himself.
I'm sure they can't really tell that it's above my chest here.
This is true. I mean, like you can tell that. Well, I mean, you can tell by the level of beard. Like yours is just a shadow, whereas mine is very much covering the like extra half chin I have. But to be fair, I did go on a 3-mile bike ride this morning. So anyway,
So fancy.
I mean, it's kind of cool. Red Bull is a hell of a lot more convenient. So when I need that kind of pick me up, I'll still buy a Red Bull, but it's certainly not horrible. And I've got 4 more cans of this stuff, so maybe I can report back later after having like 2 in a day, and hopefully I don't die.
I'll give it credit. It didn't make my stomach hurt like Monster tends to do.
This is true.
Monster is
So
just like diabetes in a can.
it really is.
As you should expect from Coca-Cola, honestly.
This is true. That's right. It's a Coke product. Man, I forgot about that. Yeah.
Hey,
All
let's
right.
bullshit over.
Yeah, let's move on to some. Well, this is a total 180 in tone. So Lee Iacocca, man, we set this up horribly. Well, we got a really funny, goofy, open topic at the beginning, 3 kind of depressing ones in the middle, and then we're gonna end with. Well, I don't know how that's gonna go. We'll see. But Lee Iacocca, so he passed away, as I said, from a bad case of 94-year-oldism. He lived a good life, and he certainly, in the pantheon of car company CEOs, he is definitely in the top 3. I think the only one who would really rank above him is Henry Ford, only because Henry Ford was just a total revolutionary.
Right.
Henry Ford made the car as we know it, or at least the process to give us the car as we know it. Lee Iacocca sort of took that whole idea and improved on it in every single way. So, Henry Ford created the assembly line. Lee Iacocca said, "Hey, we can make the assembly line better." So, 2 of the things that come to mind with Lee Iacocca and how he did that. The first was he thought, I guess, sort of pioneered, at least in the auto industry. I don't know if he got it from elsewhere in business, the idea that if you have an assembly line, you should run it at maximum capacity all the time, because that will get you the most money out of it. Because there'd be a lot of plants that would lay idle because they only built 1 or 2 models. And then the other part of that was that Lee Iacocca figured out what we would now call the sort of modular platform, where in the case of Chrysler, like all but about 2 of their models were built on that platform. So this was the K car platform. I mean, that platform lasted over a decade. I'm dead serious when I say I think at least a dozen cars were built off of that. Cars, vans, vehicles were built off of that platform, and it saved Chrysler.
There's a perfect sort of dichotomy there with the K car. Like you said, it serviced a lot of cars, and there have been 2 K cars in my family when I was growing up through now, and they were radically different. One was an old red minivan, one of those first model Dodge Caravans, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And that was
where
our
only
family car.
one door slid open, the other side was just a wall.
Yep, that weirdo thing. And now my dad has his fun car, his midlife crisis Daytona Turbo Z. And it's a sports car that used to actually do really well in road racing because of its balance and its power. And it was
Those
really
were really
good
good cars. You're right, they were really popular in the 80s. They were really good for showroom stock racing because, I mean, they were cheap cars, but they were really fast and they had a ton of potential in them.
And there were Shelby K cars. There were Shelby cars.
I know. I told you about the one that my dad's coworker had that got parted out and was gutting, because that was a real Shelby Charger Daytona. And I would say I'd argue it's probably one of the worst Shelbys, but it's still a real Shelby that Carroll Shelby designed. And now I'm pretty sure the body got crushed, which is just a total heartbreaker. But
yep, and not only the K car, with that and every subsequent generation, Lee Iacocca was able to save Chrysler and make that entire company better than well, FCA is pretty good now, but its best years were under Lee Iacocca. And when I worked at FCA for 2 years, at least for one of those years, I had a copy of Lee Iacocca's book on my desk all the time, just to make sure people remembered why this company still exists.
So, question, which book did you have on your desk? Because he's had a couple that came out.
The Leaders one.
That's a really good one. So, Oh man, I should have grabbed my copy off the bookshelf. But yeah, Lee Iacocca's book on leadership is it's really worth reading, no matter if you want to run a car company or just the local McDonald's. I mean, his vision on leadership and what makes a good leader is incredibly relevant. So he wrote that book in I think '07,
Something like
and
that.
yeah, so it's a 12-year-old book, but it's still incredibly relevant today. His 9 C's of leadership are really good, really insightful, and the best part is, of course, he explains what each one of those means, and it's kind of fun when you put those various C's up against different leaders, whether it's president or CEO or whatever. Um, Seeing how those people stack up against what Lee thought of as a leader, and one of the things that FCA does really well today is one of Lee's biggest one of the biggest things that he pushed, which was build cars that people want. Like if you actually build cars that people want, they will buy them. Don't just build into a segment, build the cars that people want. And FCA has really figured that out. And you look at their entire lineup, their trucks do really well, the Jeeps do really well, and that's what FCA is investing in. And it's
Yep,
making them
and
money, and they're starting to invest in autonomous cars and electric cars, sort of piggybacking off of other technologies that exist, but
yeah,
they're still doing it.
yeah, Lee made good-looking cars that people liked, and sure, the 80s and 90s Mopars get a lot of flack for reliability, but honestly, every American car from that generation had reliability issues. Sure, the Mopars had maybe a few more, but
Yeah, and
they were still interesting.
if you compare the like a K car to a, for example, a Chevy Chevette, it's night and day because a Chevy Chevette was bare bones transportation that would be completely dead in about 3 years. And I know this because both my parents had Chevettes, and that was the car that made them no longer want to ever buy another GM product ever again.
And
But you look at like
Neon
a
any
Plymouth.
less interesting or reliable than a Cavalier?
I would say more interesting and more reliable, actually.
Exactly.
Yeah, and so again, they're you have to put it into context. Yeah, they were not great compared to some of their competition, especially this is the sort of 2 decades where the Japanese really came into their own. And yeah, compared to the Japanese, they were not that good, but compared to where Chrysler was, well, I mean, the fact that by 1985, Chrysler had a huge fleet of small cars, and 5 years before they had none, is a huge accomplishment. And that was all Lee Iacocca. And man, when you put Lee Iacocca and Bob Lutz together, it's too bad that Lee's ego prevented him from really working well with Bob Lutz, because I think the two of them together could have just taken over the world.
And they did, and that's actually from that book, one of Lee's biggest regrets is the company slip not to Bob, letting Chrysler slip not to Bob Lutz, but to I forget who was named leader after him, but he does regret not giving that company to Bob Lutz, who he knew it would be in better hands with. But like you said, they clashed a lot. They're two big egos.
Yeah, and as both Lee and Bob have said, Lee's plan when he retired from Chrysler was ABB, anybody but Bob, and Rick Wagner. I think that's who it was. I think it was Rick Wagner who ended up taking over, and he merged immediately within about a year. Merged with Mercedes Benz.
Hold on, merged. A
As a
merger of
merger of
equals,
equals.
just like Disney and Fox, ladies and gentlemen.
Oh, Disney owns our childhood now. Just everything about it.
And
But
Mercedes
yeah,
owned the 90s because of the purchase of Chrysler.
this is very true. So, Lee's impact is still felt today. The fact that his lessons, at least to some extent, still reverberate in Chrysler is it's certainly a testament, because he retired almost 30 years ago, and the fact that the way that he ran the business still seems to at least have some bearing with how Chrysler does things now. And really, you look at GM. If they listen to really the lessons Bob Lutz brought them, they would be doing a lot better. They've sort of forgotten Bob in the past,
Yeah,
and
and
I mean, man, the two of them together.
you constantly see Bob Lutz criticizing GM, and for good reason. But you almost rarely saw Lee Iacocca criticize FCA because there was not a whole lot to criticize recently, except for maybe the reliability. But that's not an executive's place to do that.
He, if anything, he criticized management. He certainly hated the merger with Chrysler. The book he wrote came out before the Cerberus buy, and I'm pretty sure he would have hated that even more. I'm not sure. I think if we look around, we can probably find Lee's thoughts on the merger with Fiat, but certainly the way that they're running things right now, it should be a lot more agreeable to him. Again, they're building cars that people want, whether it's a Jeep or a Dodge Demon or whatever. People are buying Chryslers more than they were, 5 or 6 years ago, and that's the whole point of a business, is to sell more product than you did before and make more money consequently.
Yep, and backing up, I think we do need to point out, we've mentioned it a few times, how important and how seminal that minivan is. As much as people give the minivan crap, that was a huge thing, and for many years that was, and should still be, honestly, the number one family car for people with two kids or more. That it had a lot of space, super practical, decent on fuel, not terrible because it was sitting on a car platform. It was
It
really a
rode
revolution.
well, didn't
Yeah,
roll over like an SUV does. And I have a feeling that at some point minivans will start to make a comeback. I get the feeling that probably not our generation, because we're kind of jaded against them, but I think I think the people that are maybe, I guess they would call them Gen Z, the people who are a handful of years younger than us, they didn't grow up with minivans. They got them as their first cars, and they weren't like the car that drove them to first grade. That was the car that they learned to drive in, and they could literally take all of their friends to a movie or to McDonald's or wherever, and they had a blast with them. So I think they'll actually start making a comeback, because the group of kids, the generation after us, grew up with them as first cars, and as we all know, first cars are hugely nostalgic. So I bet we could actually see minivans making a comeback in around a decade or so.
there was a guy at Chrysler that used to say the family car is cyclic. And I think he's got a point as wagons start to become popular again. Because
Mm-hmm.
first there was the wagon as the family car, and the generation that grew up with them began to loathe the wagon. So the wagon went out of style. The next generation went to the minivan. The minivan was super popular, and then as the kids grew up, they began to loathe the minivan. And they turned to SUVs, which are cooler. And now we're starting to see, hopefully, a little more popularity coming to wagons, so maybe it's cycling back. But it's
Mm-hmm.
a generational thing, I think.
Oh, it absolutely is. And like I said, I have my theory, which will be proven. I would say by 2030, you'll start to see an uptick in the demand for minivans,
I hope
especially,
so. The Pacifica is
yeah,
a really good car.
especially when you sort of look at the future of cars in general. Will it be better to have, a pod? Well, I mean, they're all going to be kind of pods, really. Your autonomous self-driving pod, and it will make more sense to have um, a pod that can hold 8 people comfortably, that you can easily get in and out of, that you can deal with kids or pull out all the seats and put stuff into. But yeah, that's the other thing with minivans, is they are very customizable. I mean, you can pull out the back seats, you can fold them down, you can remove.
Vacuum.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's all sorts of fun stuff you can do with them. So they're really practical cars. They're just kind of saddled with the image of minivan,
Drive
which.
a Pacifica. It's actually pretty fun and kind of cool.
Mhm. Oh, absolutely. And of course, we obviously cannot end our conversation on Lee Iacocca without talking about the God car, because without Lee Iacocca,
You mean Lutz's
well,
brainchild?
it was Lutz's brainchild, but I mean, that's an interesting story. So Lee Iacocca was pushing the Chrysler TC by Maserati, which was an interesting flop, the most opulent of K cars. And here's Bob Lutz working on what I call a American muscle car cranked up to about 13. And when the TC didn't work, Lee Iacocca put his full weight behind the Viper. And I specifically remember the 1991 Indianapolis 500 because everything in my life goes back to Indy. They had a little special on TV introducing the Dodge Viper, and Lee Iacocca was there talking about it. And I think he actually got to drive one of them in the parade laps. And he was talking about how it was the first Indianapolis pace car that didn't require any performance modifications because it was actually fast enough to pace the field. Because in those days, like I remember one year they had a Fiero and they had to turbocharge the crap out of it so they could actually do 100. And I think when they come into the pits, they have to be doing like 140 or so, and most of the pace cars couldn't do it, but the Viper could because it had 400 horsepower.
God, doing 140 in the first gen Viper sounds terrifying.
Yeah, even at a giant track like Indy. Yeah, because I mean they'll pace at, I think they pace right around 100 miles an hour, and yeah, just yeah, it's an amazing car. It's really a shame that the Viper is no longer with us, but again, that was, it may not have been Lee's brainchild, but he's the one who made sure that it actually made it into production, and we thank him for it.
It's a legend, just like Lee.
Exactly. Speaking of car companies that Bob Lutz worked at, Ford.
Ugh.
Ford.
Ugh.
He worked at Ford.
He did, but
He did.
this story.
Yeah, so Ford, they are laying off 12,000 employees over the next 18 months. They say by the end of 2020, which actually I would take that to mean by about October of 2020, because I think that's the end of the fiscal year. So
I can't
give or take.
remember.
Yeah. But anyway, 18 months or so, 12,000 employees. I guess the one positive I take away from this is the cuts are across the board. It's not just closing factories. It's not just closing warehouses. I think they're cutting 2,000 salaried employees, which would include white collar workers. And I mean, it sucks for people losing their jobs, but at least it's a complete structured downsizing. It's not just cutting blue collar workers, which I always hate because a lot of layoffs tend to be that.
And
Um,
it's also going to be very heavy towards Europe, as they keep stating. I
mhm.
I question that because I don't know how many more employees they have left in Europe. They've already done a couple big layoffs over there.
Yeah, and the problem is they're not really selling a lot over there. I know the Focus is still reasonably popular, but the Mustang is, people are buying it, but not really. Obviously, nobody's buying trucks over there, which is Ford's bread and butter over here.
So I can pull back the veil a little bit on Ford Europe since I had a roommate that worked there. The Mustang is not developed by Ford Europe. That has absolutely nothing to do with it. That's 100% designed here. They just kind of flip the steering wheel and ship it over there. Uh, the Focus, Fiesta, uh, the Fusion or Mondeo, I believe is what the
Yep.
Mondeo, I believe is what they call it. Uh, I think they pulled the Taurus already. We heard on Grand Tour last season that the Mondeo is ending. Um, I don't
They
see
still
another
sell the
gen.
Fiesta over there, don't they?
They do sell a new Fiesta and a new Focus, so they did just make those for the 2019 model year. But with all these cuts happening in Europe, and if they don't make that much money on the Focus and Fiesta, and their other big money item is the Ford Transit, which does make a fair amount of money here. I don't know whether they'll start building it here, but I see a lot of dreary future for Ford Europe. They might just become a commercial car company over there because they have the established Transit over there and they make so many different variations of it. But they slowly keep cutting cars over there in Ford Europe. I don't know how many they have left. I don't know how many employees they have left. I I don't know if they might even sell Ford Europe, but there's not much left to sell. But do they try to sell the Ford? Essentially, what's left is the Transit and the Focus and Fiesta. Do they try to sell it because they keep pulling resources from Europe, and it's getting even worse. What are they? I'm wondering what they're doing here.
Well, I mean, they're already. I mean, I could just see them completely wiping out their car lineup entirely. They've already done that in the United States, or I guess they are actively doing that. I think this is going to be the last year for a lot of the cars.
No, they're all
Um,
pretty much already gone.
okay, I've only been shopping for trucks in the last year and a half, so
Well, Ford's
yeah,
got your trucks.
yes, they do. They do. They do. They even have a new truck. But they've already ended the Focus and the Fiesta and the Fusion here. I mean, I could just see them ending them in Europe, basically just pulling out of Europe entirely, which is, I mean, that's already GM's already done that. They stopped selling Chevrolets in Europe and they sold Vauxhall and Opel,
Well,
which that
the sad,
reverberation we're still feeling on the supply side.
the sad part about that would be if Ford pulls out of Europe, they're basically going to pull everything, which is really sad. When GM pulled out of Europe, all they did was sell their European brands to another European brand, so those didn't go away, and those are still popular and bought. But it would be really sad for all these European Fords, which are by and large really well liked, really good cars.
I mean, they were good over here too, but people didn't really buy them. And it's sort of weird because by all accounts, the Fusion and the Focus and the Fiesta are generally good cars. I mean, they've got a few reliability issues or sort of quirks to them, but they're good cars. But in the United States, Ford is still sort of fighting the image that they cultivated for over 30 years of not really caring. Like there were instances where Ford cared and actually built good cars. The original Taurus is certainly one of them. The first Focus as well, but they never followed through with it. Like the first Focus, it got rebodied a couple of times. It was the same car that was sold here over a decade later. Um, the Taurus went from being a brilliant new mid-size American car to being just terrible. So,
Ford
you
in and
know,
of itself is also struggling with identity right now. They keep calling themselves a mobility company and they're not really sure what they want to be. And I think what they want to be is just a high stock price. They're really trying to push for that, and they're claiming investment in autonomous and EV technology, not really showing that, but they're trying their best to become a mobility company and not a car company per se. So who knows what's going on? And just from a people perspective, I don't want that to get lost here. I've been on the end of a company making an announcement like this of several layoffs and how the time frame of it, and it sucks. It sucks for people on the line. It sucks for white collar workers because you're essentially got a gun to your head for however many months it takes for Ford to do this, and you don't know what's going to happen to you. And it's very transparently for to see if people will leave on their own because frankly that's much cheaper for the company. But I feel bad for every employee at Ford because they, at least when GM did their mass layoffs, they did do it in one swoop. It's sure they might do it again, but Ford has, this is like their third time now doing this, and it sucks.
yeah, and I actually want to jump back quickly to where you were talking about you're not sure or Ford isn't sure of what they are or want to be. A lot of times when you see a mass layoff like this, especially announced so early on, I mean it's typical for companies to announce layoffs early because as you said, if people quit, that's cheaper for the company. But 18 months is a lot of time. And when companies make a lot of cuts like this, and again, this is not the first Ford cut. They already had one last year. They've got this one coming up. I think by the end of this, they're going to have laid off something like 20,000 people in under 3 years. That's a lot of people. That is a lot of cutting. And when you see companies that just hack off giant bits of themselves, whether it's employees or divisions, And in this case, Ford is kind of doing both. They've hacked off their car market in the US. They could potentially do that in Europe. They're hacking off large numbers of employees. That's not a sign of a stable car company or stable any company. Um, I mean, close to home, that happened to DuPont. They were chasing stock price, exactly what Ford is doing. They hacked off large divisions of their company, and I think a year ago they finally got bought out. A 100-year-old chemical company, the biggest in Delaware and one of the biggest on the East Coast, and it just got bought out by a competitor. So, you know, if you chase stock price too hard, you end up in this reality of just a mess. And I fear, I'm not saying that Ford's about to go bankrupt, but this kind of business practice just doesn't work.
It really doesn't, and it's really annoying because whenever I've done some interviews with companies like Hyundai and Nissan, and the way Japanese and Korean companies work is completely different than how American companies work. Curly, how many times do you see news about Honda layoffs or Hyundai layoffs or Toyota layoffs? How often do you hear about that?
Never. I think the
Never.
last time we heard about it was 10 years ago when everybody was laying off people.
Yeah, and even then, the cuts were very minimal, even at a company like Nissan, who are not the highly regarded Japanese brand. And it's
Mm-hmm.
because these companies, I think they understand how to continue to function better than some of the American car companies. You see all these cycles of mass layoffs and mass hirings, and I really, really don't think that works.
No,
As
it
a part
doesn't.
of
It's a really bad way of running business.
and
As you mentioned, the Japanese they don't do these mass layoffs, and of course, the biggest reason is if you're in a poor cycle, because businesses do go through cycles, industries go through cycles, car companies go through cycles, markets go through cycles. If you're in a downward turn or you're in a low point, you are working to grow again, and at some point you will probably grow if you make the right decisions. And if you lay off a bunch of your salaried staff, especially your experienced staff, you lose that experience. You cannot buy experience. And you get to the point where you've made all these layoffs, you've lost all these people, and now you have to replace them, and you're going to replace them with new people. And they may be brilliant. They may have 20 years of auto industry experience, but if they don't have 20 years of experience in your company, there's always going to be a learning period where they have to learn that company's culture. They have to learn the processes. They have to adjust the way that they work. And that all takes time. And while you're trying to catch up, someone else is going to get ahead of you. And that is definitely one area where the Japanese and the Koreans excel is they're very smart about shuffling people around, or well, more importantly, they don't overhire to begin with. They're a lot smarter about the levels of management, the number of people on teams, and making the most out of their resources.
Yep, and that's why I'm going to give FCA some credit once again. Because it seemed kind of cheap when FCA started losing engineer after engineer and not replacing them. But in reality, what was happening was everyone kind of slotted into their place there. Everyone had their reason for being there, had their task, had their model. When you go to places like GM, when GM had the mass hiring, they hired a ton of people over a span of 3 years or so. I think they hired like 15,000 people, and GM became bloated. And you start thinking to yourself, why am I here again? Why do I have a job? And that becomes a problem.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people at GM or Ford, they get overworked, and there's a lot of people that are very underworked. FCA has finally gotten to the point where, yes, there are a few people that get overworked, but they have a lot of people that are just plain worked, and that's fine. No one's really underworked anymore, and that's FCA has more than the other two. leaned out and prepared themselves very well for a potential downturn, and they're starting to become a little more like the Japanese companies, a little more streamlined. Whereas I think GM and Ford might still be in the mindset of fire a lot of people in the bad, hire a lot of people in the good, and that's not sustainable anymore.
I actually think, from my limited experience working with European companies, that it's not just a Japanese Korean thing. I think it's an American versus, a sort of European Japanese capitalism mentality. The Germans they're a lot better at managing people versus workload. The one thing about the Japanese is, because they typically work fairly lean, you are generally overworked. It is not uncommon for them to do 60 or more hours a week, as some of our friends know just from working for the American side of those companies. So, it's I think the Europeans probably do it the best, where they have a much better balance of people versus workload. I think sometimes the Japanese cut it too thin, and again, that means you don't have to lay off a bunch of people. But if you overwork the people that are there, that's also not good. And the Americans are kind of boom bust. When things are good, you hire a lot of people. When things aren't so good, you fire a lot of them. And that boom bust it's just not good for any economy, much less your own market and your own business. It's easy to assume that, oh, in this day and age, people will move for work, but there's not a huge incentive. You have to make that incentive, that carrot, really big to get someone to move a few hundred or a few thousand miles for work. And for, I would say, the majority of jobs, that carrot's just not big enough. And eventually you get to the point where you've exhausted all your local resources. That's actually a problem that I've sort of seen at my current job. Is we've exhausted the local supply of workers, both white collar and blue collar. There's only so many small towns you can pick from before you've run out of people, because you've either tried them and they haven't worked, or you already have them, or you fired them and pissed them off, and now they're not coming back.
Yep, it's a tough business right now, and I really hope that this downturn, whenever it does come, helps the American companies, specifically GM and Ford, learn. Maybe they'll learn their lesson this time. I'm not banking on it, but
No.
yeah, probably not.
Why would they learn?
But let's
Why would they
let's
learn when
hope.
they have a golden parachute, just like I'm sure the CEO of BMW does?
Oh man, speaking of job cuts,
This case, just one job. Um, so I should have written down the guy's name, but
Kruger,
Kruger only ran BMW for 4 years, and in four
Harald
years,
Kruger.
Gerald Kruger, in 4 years, he really hasn't done anything. Like,
He
aside
confused the
from
lineup.
yeah, aside from make an SUV and a coupe version of everything, and then make an M version of all of those. So I actually went onto their website today, and in the US, if you disclude the button for the M cars, which is its own separate section, there are 17 individual models of BMW you can buy, and that is not including two-door versus four-door, or the whatever they call them, the Grand Touring with the lift back, or all-wheel drive, or the engine. 17 individual models. I think there were 7 SUVs, like 9 sedans, and then the i3 and the i8. I think there was one other, and then they also had a spot for the M cars, which again is like everything has an M version or an M Sport version. There's just there's
Except
too
the M4.
much
The
there's
M4 is
too
gone.
much stuff. There's just way too much stuff in there. They've tried to go after, for a long time BMW is actually really good at segment busting, where they found sort of this area between, you know sort of between segments, where you'd say, okay, well, a mid-sized car doesn't work, a mid-sized SUV doesn't work, so let's make a cross between the two. But they've done so many of those now that I feel, my opinion is, they're poaching sales from themselves, because instead of having one car, or let's say two cars, that are actually, 90% of what certain people need. They've made a third car that they think is 100% of what people need, and they've had to make all that investment, and it's lower profit. So it's just, yeah,
And
they make too much stuff, and then they didn't invest in the things that they really need to, which is really surprising. So we've already talked a lot on this show about electric cars and autonomous vehicles. BMW pioneered both of those. The i3 and the i8 were pioneer electric vehicles. You had a fully electric supercar, you had a fully electric small car, and BMW made those, and they've sat on them to the point where I think both of those are going to leave without a replacement. BMW did autonomous cars. What was it? So about 10 years ago, they had that lap of the Top Gear test track in a completely self-driving, I think it was a 3 Series. Jeremy Clarkson pushes go and the car does its own lap. And yes, it was a very rudimentary system, but the fact that it could do that without any input from him 10 years ago is really impressive. And what have they done since then? Nothing.
chasing profits by adding
Exactly.
more segments. It's really sad because the i8 is actually a really cool car, but it
So is the
hasn't been
i3
touched in
for that
years.
matter. The
Yeah,
i3 is a pretty neat car.
they're both neat in their own way, but they haven't been touched in years, and it's especially a crime on the i8. That thing is just make that thing
That's what.
cooler.
Oh, we got to jump back that they haven't been touched in years. That's what she said.
Hey, I resemble that.
Phrasing. We're not doing phrasing anymore. Is that just not going to be a thing?
Phrasing, boom.
But you're right. They were both great cars when they came out, and BMW hasn't done anything with them, and now they're behind the times, and there's not really anything in the pipeline coming in to either update or replace them. And it's really a shame because BMW has always, and I'm not a huge BMW fan, but I appreciate
I
that
am.
oh, I know you are, sir. I'm not a huge BMW fan, but I do appreciate that they've always been the pioneers of technology, whether it's semi-automatic transmissions or variable valve timing or um, traction control, electronic diffs, all that good stuff. They have always been on the pioneer of technology, and right now they're behind the times, and that's really worrying because being at the forefront of technology is one of the things that BMW has always been really good at. And if they lose that, they're going to get lost in the field of not just German cars, but the American challengers like Tesla or
Alpha.
even or even really, GM could even be thrown in there because they're making a lot of mistakes, but at least they're pushing for the future. And that's not something BMW is.
Yep, and they're even
If anything,
moving.
those are sort of two opposite companies because you have GM, which is kind of screwing up the right now, but is at least investing in the future. And then you have BMW, who is doing really good right now, but they're not investing in the future.
Yeah,
So prediction in 2022, GM and BMW will merge.
that would be a weird merger, man. That'd be weird.
You know what the weirdest part would be? GM would have control of, or at least have a hand in the next generation Minis and Rolls Royces.
So what you're saying is the next Rolls-Royce is going to have a 16-cylinder concept engine, and then they'll never make one.
Yes.
R.I.P. Escala.
Yeah, I do like one of the points you have on here. The BMWs do look good. By the way, I also want to throw in Volkswagen makes really good looking cars right now. I saw, so I just did 1,200 miles on the road. I saw a Volkswagen Arteon and I went, oh my God, I would buy the hell out of that car. It is
Right, it's a
good
really
looking.
good-looking sedan.
It is, and it's the right size too. It's not too big. It's not too small. Volkswagen's doing good too. BMW makes good-looking cars. They've gotten past the kind of weird Chris Bangle era. But I will say, given that, if you debadged a 2, 3, and 4 and put them next to each other, I, not being a BMW person, would have no idea which one is which.
I mean, you could see the size differences between the 2, 3, and the 4, and 2 of them have 2 doors.
Yeah, I know that. I know the 3 Series is a 4-door. The 4 Series is a 3 Series that's a 2-door, which makes no sense there. It's
But
either
the 4
way.
Series also comes in a 4-door to confuse things just a little bit more.
Yeah, so it's
But even those cars are kind of still stuck in time. The last 7 series I drove was kind of a good car, but loses badly to the S class and even something like the Genesis. The M2 was a fantastic car when I test drove
hold
it.
on, I want to jump back there. What does the 7 Series lose to in those cars?
It's the front seat's not as comfortable, the rear seat's not quite as comfortable, not quite as many adjustments as the others. It doesn't ride quite as nicely. The S class, that's where it kind of shines. That thing is literally a boat floating on the road. Nothing phases it. The S class has a classier interior. The BMW is so loaded with tech that it kind of loses that je ne sais quoi that the S class and the Rolls have, that little bit of class. And then something like the Genesis comes through and says, you know what, we're going to make it super comfortable for that guy in the rear seat. He's going to be so happy. And they go in there and they step up and they slap BMW in the face and say, take your tablet and shove it. I just made it really comfy back there. But
Interesting consumer advice if you're looking to spend six figures on a car. Apparently, you just swallow your snobbery and buy 2 Genesises. Genesises. I'm gonna go with Genesises.
damn right, drive the G70 on the weekends with the manual transmission, and then get driven around in your G90. That sounds like a time, man. I would love that.
All right. So
I'm
speaking
not a
of
Hyundai
things,
spokesman, I swear.
well, speaking of things that BMW has abandoned, Formula One.
And kind of racing in
Oh,
general, except for didn't they pull out a GT?
yeah, they're pulling out a GT at the end of this year with the 8 Series was actually a really good car, but I think they only had it for 2 years. I think there's going to be some teams that are going to run it privately, but the factory effort is dead after this year. Actually, no, I think it's in IMSA, it's dead at the end of this year. In World Endurance, it's dead now because the end of the season was Le Mans. I realized as slightly off topic, but the the WEC decided to make the end of the championship at Le Mans. Not a single person talked about the fact that Fernando Alonso also won the WEC championship along with his second Le Mans.
Just because honestly, the race matters a lot more than the championship.
Yeah,
To be
exactly.
perfectly honest,
And you're 100% right. Why in the hell did they do that? Because no one's going to talk about the championship. No one's going to talk about the championship at the end of October when they have their last race of the year and then go on hiatus for 6 months. It was just a stupid decision. Anyway, Formula One, real man's racing.
yes, F1 happened.
Well, so it more than just happened. So if this was 3 weeks ago and we were talking about France, yeah, that race just happened. But this was Austria, and many things happened. I've got notes on notes on notes on notes, and we'll get to as
He
many of them as we can.
he wrote a novel. I wrote bullet points.
They're bullet points too. If I did them as bullet points, I would have gone up to well, way more Roman numerals than we have. But the first one is Honda. They finally won a race. Yay, Honda! It's I genuinely feel bad for them because I think that, well, it's been pretty well proven McLaren screwed Honda because McLaren wanted one thing and Honda couldn't possibly deliver it, and McLaren refused to budge. They basically, because McLaren has said for they've always said this in the history, they are not an engine company, they are a car company. They will always buy their engines, and yet they dictated what Honda did in Formula One. You have to make the engine this size. You have to put the turbocharger in like this. You have to do it like this. You have to do it like that. And Honda just couldn't deliver that their first year. And you could actually see, so for the first 2 years, Honda built their engine one way. The biggest development in Formula One with the V6 turbo hybrids has been taking the turbocharger and instead of having your compressor and turbine wheel right next to each other, you put them on either side of the engine because it keeps the hot bits on one side and the cold bits on the other side and makes for much better packaging. And McLaren specifically told Honda not to do that, even though Mercedes did that. They'd already seen the advantages of that. McLaren said, no, 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 do it the old way. They did that for 2 years. It didn't work. McLaren finally said, okay, do it the way you want to do it. and they spent another year in development. You could see in 2017 Honda was getting good, and in 2018 they did a nosedive because they had to completely redo their engine. They actually said at the end of 2017 their 2018 engine was going to be 95% new. After 2 years of development, they're going to replace 95% of the engine.
And their engine went into a Toro Rosso, who, while decent cars, are not exactly front of the pack cars.
But that was a good thing because 2018 was a mess. It was very public. I mean, you could see they were making more power, but they still had reliability problems. And by the way, every other engine supplier went through the same exact thing. Ferrari in 2014 had a regular turbocharger. It didn't work. In 2015, they went with a split turbo, and that's when you had lots and lots of turbocharger failures. But they'd figured that out in 2016, and they started winning races. Renault did the same thing in 2016, and that was where Red Bull, the shirt you're wearing right now, got into the big spat with Renault over reliability because these new turbochargers are very difficult. You've got, instead of a little short spinning shaft going at 250,000 RPM, you now got a really, really long turbocharger shaft that is introducing a ton of vibration. And the tolerances in turbochargers are so tight that if you cannot control those shaft vibrations, you're going to destroy the turbo. And that's exactly what happened to everybody. So Honda already knew this going in. McLaren refused to let them do their own thing, and it screwed them. And now Red Bull is seeing the fruits of McLaren's failures. Honda's spent 2 years developing this engine. It is really good. It actually makes more power than the Renaults. It is as reliable as, I would say, the Ferrari. The Mercedes is still the benchmark. More power than anybody else and more reliable than everybody else.
Actually, I think Ferrari has gained the advantage in power recently. Ferrari's eating
In qualifying,
tires,
definitely. In qualifying, they definitely have the power advantage. I think they have a deployment advantage on the hybrid system, but I think on the engine side, Mercedes is still better, though they do have a couple of chinks because the reason that they were not very fast in Austria is they were overheating the entire race, and they had to keep slowing down. They were saying something like, I think it was like 200, no, I think 40% of the lap was lift and coast because they were trying to keep the engine cool. So,
do you know why the Red Bull Hondas were running so cool?
why?
Because they were in the VTAC all the time, brah.
VTEC definitely kicked in.
They let him open up the VTAC at the end.
This is true. But, you know, Honda has spent, they got 3 years of a really bloody nose with McLaren. And credit to them, they could have just quit when McLaren said they weren't interested anymore. And I don't think anybody would have blamed Honda for quitting, but they stuck with it. They spent a year in the Toro Rosso developing. That proved to the Red Bull bosses that it was worth putting in the back of the Red Bull proper, though I think there really wasn't much of a choice. I did not see that. I never saw an extension of the Renault contract with Red Bull after all the things Red Bull said, after Helmut Marko and Cyril Abiteboul almost got into a fist fight in the pit lane in Brazil. There was no way they were going to stick with Renault, but that patience has paid off, and now Red Bull has something that Ferrari and Mercedes don't, which is its own engine, and apparently a pretty good one. I would genuinely not be surprised if in 2020, if Red Bull can come out of the gate strong with their car, I'm sure Honda will come out strong with the engine, and I could very easily see Max Verstappen challenging Hamilton and, let's be honest, Leclerc for the championship.
Yeah, and let's be real here. McLaren, I know you're a big fan of them, but Red Bull have some of the best technical minds in the sport right now. They have some of the best technical minds. And
they have the best technical mind, which is Adrian Newey.
And some of the best strategic mind with Christian Horner. How many other teams have changed leaders in the past few years, and Horner's just been there?
And he's going to be there for a long time because I think he's only in his mid-40s, so he's got easily another decade of running that team, and they will keep him around forever because he does a great job. I mean, he manages the drivers, he manages the technicians and the engineers, and he gets the results. So
and he's one hell of a mediator between the top guys and the drivers.
He does a really good job of that. He's had a couple of hiccups, but for the most part, he's kept the drivers from bloodying each other's noses.
But yeah,
So,
they've got some of the best technical minds in the sport on Red Bull. You've got some of the best technical minds at Honda and the resources. These two companies are not lacking of resources. So they're only going to continue to grow, and they're going to grow at an exceptional rate.
oh, absolutely, and um, I agree. McLaren's struggling. When they were talking about, oh, we've got the best chassis on the grid, but the engine in the back of the car is letting us down. That was just bullshit. There's no other word for it. It was total bullshit. They had major chassis problems, and they've had chassis problems for a long time. Their weakness has been in aerodynamics for the better part of a decade. I mean, they haven't had a competitive chassis since 2012.
And you could tell when they got destroyed in Monaco and Singapore, which are always the great equalizers.
Well, I mean, if Jenson Button hadn't pissed in the seat, maybe he would have done better in Monaco. Actually, to be fair to Jenson, he didn't want to be there. He was called up. They threw a big check in front of him. If anything, it's more surprising that he actually made it that far into the race without intentionally screwing up or whatever. McLaren has their own set of issues, and as much as it disappointed me for McLaren and Honda to split, because I really thought that partnership, it wouldn't have brought races by this time, but I feel like it would have brought them a lot further up in the field. There's no doubt that Honda and Red Bull, that was going to be a winning combination, whereas McLaren and Honda were going to be it was much more of a crapshoot.
So
I mean, I had no doubt that Red Bull was going to win a race this year. It was just a matter of when. And if anything, I want to say it came sooner than I expected, but I also expected them to do a bit better at Monaco, but Mercedes was really good there. I really didn't expect after Monaco to see Red Bull competitive until Singapore again.
Absolutely, since that, like we said, that's the equalizer. So we've kind of been dancing around it. Curly, what happened at the end of this race to get Honda this finally a victory?
Let's start with rewinding a little bit, mostly to the day before and qualifying, because Charles Leclerc, he put on an incredible pole lap. I remember watching that and thinking there's no way he was going to do a second lap that was better than his first. And then he took out I think he took out 3/10 from his first lap, and he was in traffic. Charles Leclerc's pole lap was stunning. Charles Leclerc, if he can stay in a good car, if either Ferrari can continue to push to produce good cars for him, or if he one day moves to Mercedes while they're still doing well, I could actually see him getting more poles than Lewis Hamilton, and that's saying something, because Hamilton is still winning poles, and Leclerc's pole lap was just beautiful. Unfortunately, his race pace wasn't as good. He started on the softs, so he could only go about 15 laps into the race before he had to change tires, whereas Max Verstappen in the Red Bull started out on the mediums, which meant he was able to go almost twice as far, which meant at the end of the race he had much better tires. They were all on hards, but he didn't have to conserve his. And unfortunately for Max, he had a poor start. Went into Andy's stall, got lucky he didn't get run over, and he actually put on an amazing race too. He fought his way through the field. He played it really smart. If this was a year ago, I think he would have crashed out in the first corner trying to make up too many positions, but he played it super smart, and he worked his way back up, and he and Charles had a wonderful battle for the lead. And then there was the touch. And in this case, it was a bad touch. And they also needed an adult, because the FIA had to look into this one. And I think if this had been an incident in isolation, it wouldn't have become a major headline. And it's really a shame that it did, because the Austrian race was really good. It has by far been the best race of the year. There was a ton of action on track, a ton of interesting storylines. But once again, the result is overshadowed by the FIA having to stick their nose into things. And by the letter of the rules, they had to. Um, I think also by the letter of the rules, they were right. They didn't call a penalty. And if anything, I think if they had called a penalty on Verstappen, that would have made way too many people upset. I don't think that would have been good for the sport because this is the third race in a row where a penalty would have decided the outcome of the race. In Canada, the FAA put a penalty on Vettel. He crossed the finish line first, got a 5-second penalty, ended up second. In France, very next race, 2 weeks later, Daniel Ricciardo got 2 penalties, and he dropped from, I think, 7th to 11th, completely out of the points. And then here you've got the third race in a row, third race in 3 weeks, where a penalty could have really affected the outcome of the race at the very end or after the race. And fortunately, it didn't. But it's starting to become a problem. I think part of it is, and I don't have it in the notes, but I think part of it is, Charlie Whiting passed away very suddenly at the beginning of the year, and he is the guy who would have referred these decisions to the stewards, and I don't think he would have referred Leclerc or Vettel. I don't think he would have referred those to the stewards, and they would have nothing would have happened. There wouldn't have even been an investigation. But he's not around anymore, and I think the people who are replacing him are still trying to figure out how to run the races. How do they want to run the races? And running races is really difficult. I spent a short amount of time running go-kart leagues, and you're not going to please everybody, but you will please the most people if you're consistent. And finding that consistency doesn't happen overnight. So if you make a controversial call, but you continue to make that call, or you call a move, bumping into somebody, if you call that as a penalty consistently, people will stop running into you because they know they will get a penalty. The FAA has major problems with track limits because there's infinite runoff now. There's no grass except at Austria, which it turns out works really well to get people to stay on the track. If you're concerned about track limits, you call track limit penalties consistently. If you say you have to keep all 4 tires on the inside of the white line and someone goes off, you call a penalty and that's it. And if you do that enough, people won't go all 4 wheels off anymore. So, where we are right now is it's a combination of a lot of things. The first is definitely the way the tracks are. They're safer now, but because you have infinite runoff, there's no penalty for going over a curb. Austria, in this case, did have a penalty. You either had grass or you broke your front wing or damaged your car, or both things happened and you crashed. So that was sort of a self-policing track. But at France 2 weeks ago, there is no grass. It is all asphalt. So you could run off and get back on and you don't lose any time, or you could actually gain positions, as happened to Carlos Sainz. The cars themselves are really difficult to see out of. Part of that is due to safety. Part of that is due to the engineers trying to get the drivers as low as humanly possible because they are the tallest point of the car. So the cars are difficult to see out of. The cars are huge. So it's difficult to really see where it is. I don't think any of the drivers would readily admit that it is difficult to see out of the cars, and some of the contact we're seeing is just due to the fact that they couldn't see the other car, or they couldn't really judge where the corner of their car was compared to the other car. And then, of course, it's the drivers themselves. They're under a ton of pressure. In my opinion, I think a lot of drivers come in a few years too young. I will say Max Verstappen is a good example of that because his first 3 years, he was really very, very fast, but he was also kind of wild and reckless. And this year in particular, he's toned it back 2 or 3%. He's still really quick, but he is making much smarter decisions, and that you can only do that with experience. I think Charles Leclerc, again, great. I think he could have probably done with another year in Sauber or maybe even in GP2.
I mean, you could also say similar things about Hamilton and Vettel. Those
Oh,
two came in pretty
absolutely.
young and were pretty wild.
Oh, absolutely. Hamilton came in really young. In some ways, he got a bit lucky. He came into McLaren, and they were still doing really well. Ferrari wasn't doing great. There weren't really any other consistent competitors. So his first championship was a bit lucky, but he's certainly gotten a lot better with age. He's again toned it down, but he's still incredibly quick. But when you get these young guys in who don't have experience, they've never really been in an unsafe car aside from a go-kart. And they feel like they're invincible, especially when you put them in a car where they are so well protected. You put them on a track that has tons and tons of runoff. Um, it's easy to make crazy moves and just assume that everything will be okay. Actually, there was an interview with John Watson, retired driver, and he even said that the new drivers, the drivers of today, of all ages, feel invincible because F1 is very safe and they make moves. They attempt moves that you would have never attempted 20 or 30 years ago because you knew that if you took another car off or yourself, there was a good chance you would get really badly hurt or killed. And that's not really the case today. So, you've got all these various factors put together that I think add up to what we have to have right now. The drivers push too hard. They're willing to take every little piece of gray area. The tracks are really, the tracks are, they're too big and too open. The cars are too safe and too difficult to see out of. And I hope that in 2021, when they really push through these rules, that all three of these things are addressed, because I want to see the drivers self-police. But until those other factors are addressed, that's not possible, because the drivers will continue to run each other off the track because they know it's safe, or they'll continue to run themselves off the track when it's advantageous because they can and they know they're not going to get a penalty, whether it's a time penalty or going off into the wall. So, where we're at is just the combination of a whole bunch of different things, and they've all culminated here. Individual decisions that in isolation were okay, but when added together create a situation where the FIA, the sanctioning body, has to constantly go in and say, no, that wasn't okay. You have to get a time penalty, or, that wasn't okay. You're going to get driver's points. And it's a shame, but it's just where we are right now. But all that can be unwound, and it's going to take some sacrifice from the drivers and I think from the FIA as well.
I do want to push back a little bit on the feeling invincible thing. Sure, drivers today feel invincible because cars are safer, but drivers of yesteryear felt invincible too, but that's because of pure gigantic balls and stupidity.
I wouldn't say they thought they were invincible. They just thought it wouldn't happen to them. They knew the risks, but they played the odds because I guess the way I look at it is, your own limits as a driver. Okay, if I push this corner this hard, I can make it, but if I push it this much harder, I could go off. And when you didn't have any runoffs, and when the cars were made out of aluminum, and your feet were the crumple zones, you said, okay, instead of pushing this corner at 98%, I'm only going to push it at 94%, because if I push it to 95, the chance of me going off increases by 20%, and I'm not willing to take that. And you also realized that if you touched another car and you sent them off the track, they could go into the wall and you could hurt or kill a person. Some drivers were a lot more respectful of that than others. There were some drivers, there's always been drivers in history who have just been wild and crazy, and they don't understand the risks, and it's come back and killed them, or they have killed other drivers. That is just a fact of racing. But yeah, again, you played the odds. You knew who you could push hard. You knew who was playing it more conservative. You knew who was always wild and crazy, and you drove accordingly. But you didn't do things like block, because if you get hit, you're going into the wall and it's going to hurt really bad. You don't brake check people because, again, if you get run into, you're going into a wall and it's going to hurt. And
speaking of blocking and going into walls, can I transition this into NASCAR?
Yes, when I finish my thought. It could hurt really bad, or it might not hurt at all because you just get killed instantly. Or every driver's worst fear is you're okay, but you're trapped in the car and it's now on fire and you burn to death. So there's definitely a difference in how, and you can even see it even 20 years ago. I will partly blame Michael Schumacher for some of what we see now because he made it okay. He won his first world championship taking out Damon Hill. Um, and when a Formula One world champion does it, it's now okay for everybody to do it. And at some point, you being the top drivers in the world, the top 20 drivers that everybody look up to, you have to set an example, no matter what the result is. So now, yes, you can transition into NASCAR and blocking and brake checking, because a lot of that happens in NASCAR, as it turns out. I did see the clips. That was wild. So
Yes,
please enlighten us into the rest of it. What wasn't posted on Twitter?
so while Curly went on his rant about his little F1 drivers touching each other inappropriately, time to talk about some banging into each other.
Slamming and banging, and they didn't even use any lube.
So in the so in the past few years, NASCAR has made a lot of rule changes, going from the restrictor plate to the tapered spacer. They've reduced a lot of power, made it very momentum based, very aero based. So if your car is more aerodynamic, then you're going to be faster out in front, but you're going to struggle in traffic because then you're not going to have any downforce. So a lot of this. So today the race was at Daytona, and this has led to a whole lot of blocking, and it finally came to a head in practice when William Byron, for some reason, decided to block Brad Keselowski in practice, no less. Um, so it's at the point now where NASCAR has normalized blocking enough that people are blocking in practice.
So before
And
you go on, what happened when William Byron blocked Brad Keselowski?
he went to a backup car. He started with another
Got
car.
put into the wall.
Well, no, he
That's
actually
the
didn't hit he actually didn't hit the wall. He just went off the banking into the grass. But it was
oh,
the but it
which
was
is
the
just as bad.
transition onto the from the banking damaged his right rear, and it was enough damage that they had to go to the backup car. But it kind of set the precedent of the weekend. That blocking was Brad fired the first shot in it not being okay anymore. Because it was kind of widely accepted until that point that blocking was just a part of this new rules package and that you had to do it or else you're going to get passed. And if you block, that guy behind you is going to back off, he's going to lose momentum, and you're going to stay ahead. So that's just been the logic the past year or so with this package. And finally, drivers have become sick of it, which led to two massive accidents today in Daytona, and it was they were some really dumb blocks. It was that old school coming right across someone's nose where the car was actually underneath them, and towards the end of the race, they we had maybe 5 to 10 cars that were undamaged. Uh,
I
but
saw the video of Austin Dillon in the lead, cutting across, I think it was Clint Boyer's nose, and
yes,
just
sir.
got completely taken out. So he got taken out, and since he was in the lead, it was literally the crash from Talladega Nights.
Yep, and frankly, Clint Boyer got the worst end of that stick as he went flying backwards into the giant pack, and that's never a good place to be facing the pack that's coming at you.
No, not at all. How many cars did that involve? Like, it was literally half the field, wasn't it? I think it was 19 or 20 cars.
Because it was at the front, that was about a 20 car accident.
Yeah, and
And
the starting field is 40 cars, so it was pretty
about
much
half the
half the
field, yeah.
field got taken out with one dumb move.
Well, seriously damaged. A lot of them were trying to still
That's
go,
true. Yeah, they didn't.
and
But of
the
course, they
reason they
also
were
have the 5 minute rule now for what's 5 minutes for fixing your car.
on in the pits. You have 5 minutes to get your car to the condition where it can go make minimum speed.
Okay.
So, but they never really got the chance to do that because that crash happened right before some rain. well, not really rain, lightning was striking the area,
Hmm.
and not just the blocking part. I wanted to talk about kind of the bonehead call that happened because we haven't really heard a whole lot about this. But so what happened was after that, I think William Byron was in the lead. Um, no, Kurt Busch was in the lead, and everybody behind him during that caution came down and we got either tires or fuel, whatever they wanted. And NASCAR then gave the signal for one to go. And in a very confusing move, Kurt Busch and a lot of drivers behind him pulled off and pitted, even though they saw the dark clouds right over there that rain was coming. And right after Kurt came down, they threw the caution again. And Kurt was livid because his strategy call, which was confusing to begin with, because if you were going to come down during the caution and you could make it, do it with everybody else. Everybody else did it at the beginning. Just do it then.
Which
Instead,
is the normal. You always, when the yellow comes out, you immediately come into the pits.
yes, and I think that what they were trying to do was replicate what Ricky Stenhouse did earlier, which was he came out of the pits and timed it so perfectly where he was able to hit the restart with full momentum, trying to catch the field. And I think
Hmm.
he passed about 3 cars with that momentum and just continued to carve through the rear end of the field thanks to all that momentum. So that's what they were trying to do, but it was still a bonehead call when you were out in front to come down with one to go when you know weather is coming. It gave up the race, and I know Kurt was really mad at NASCAR, but I feel like he really should be mad at his crew chief for making that call. Steve Letarte, who is a very good crew chief in his own right, straight up questioned the move in the booth. He was absolutely baffled as to why they did this. But when push came to shove, this left Justin Haley in uh,
So I want to
in the
jump back
lead.
just to sort of fill things in. So the reason that Austin Dillon, because again, I briefly looked up on this before we started, the reason Austin Dillon was so desperate to stay in front and do a bonehead block like he did was because he knew rain was coming and he wanted to be out front. Because when rain is coming and you don't know when, you have to be out front. Because if the rain comes down, especially on an oval, that could be the end of the race. If it's past half distance, they will call the race then and there. So that's why Austin Dillon was blocking. It came
In
back and bit him.
Yep,
And for, as Tom is saying, for Kurt Busch and his crew chief, they know, okay, the rain is on its way. We need to do everything possible to stay out in front, no matter what.
and they didn't.
Yep.
It was absolutely baffling, and to NASCAR's credit, and I think a huge chunk of this was the fact that a guy named Justin Haley on his third start was leading the race when they're so important for playoff standings and playoff points. They tried really hard to get this going. They had drivers in their cars after one lightning countdown because of course NBC made a lightning clock after the first bit. Uh, you had to wait 30 minutes once lightning strikes within an 8-mile radius. So they tried to get it back going. They almost did, but in the end, they had to pull the plug because it's Florida in the summer. Rain and thunderstorms are going to happen. And so Justin Haley is the winner of this race because he A, survived the carnage, and B, made the move that Curly said so eloquently that when you see rain coming, you stay out in front at all costs.
Who does he drive for?
Um,
It's one of the tiny teams.
I forget the actual name. It starts with an S, but that's a really weird team because they don't have a consistent driver. They put like a new guy in there every week. And in a very confusing move, they bought the 78's points.
Hmm.
Yeah.
I didn't know that was a thing.
Yeah,
Wait, so they
apparently
bought
it
their
is
points
now.
or their charter?
Yes.
Okay.
For the first few races of the
Uh,
year, they were running on the 78's points.
oh, okay. So the owner's points, they can get a guaranteed start. I got it. NASCAR, if y'all haven't figured it out, is confusing as hell, and they keep making it worse and worse. In my opinion, it's like it's on the level of American football. It's just I can't keep up with it.
But it's tough. It was tough to watch. The blocking was insane, and I'm not even gonna get started on the manufacturer's orders because guess what? That was a thing today. And if it's on YouTube, and I really hope it is, please refer to Dale Jr.'s rant on this situation because he did not hold back in the booth, and I applaud you, Dale Jr.
What were the manufacturer's orders? Was this just who you have to run with someone of your own nameplate?
Yeah, the executives from Ford and Chevy specifically, Toyota was kind of like a handshake agreement because there's only 6 of them.
And
That,
four of them are on the same team anyway.
yep, that all of the Chevys and all the Fords were going to work together if at all possible. And they even coordinated to the point where all of the Chevrolets and all of the Fords and the Toyotas actually tagged along with the Chevys. They all pitted at the same time too, with the same strategy, and it was bizarre and infuriating to watch the 4 Hendrick drivers in line, nobody trying to overtake each other at the end of a stage. I threw up in my mouth a little bit, and I think Junior did too, and he kind of exploded later in the
Apparently threw up all over the
broadcast.
microphone verbally.
He did. He exploded over it. He was not happy about any of this at all, and he voiced his displeasure and the fact that he says he would tell Chevy to shove it if they tried to tell him that.
Well, NASCAR, much like Formula One, has made a bunch of decisions that in isolation, should work, but when put together, have come together with a very strange situation. And, I think I can't remember if we talked about it on here, but, you know, aside from 3 races now, 2 teams have won every single race in 2019.
2 point
And
races.
yeah, it's a 3 points races now. So, but again, it's difficult to win, and that's all on NASCAR. They have put themselves into this situation, and when it's this hard to win, the manufacturers are going to do everything possible because this is their advertising. If you're not, especially if you're in a Chevrolet, and Hendrick Chevrolets have only won 2 races out of whatever they're up to right now, 18 or so. You're going to do whatever you can to take another one, especially at Daytona. So, I don't blame the manufacturers for doing this. It sucks. It's awful to watch, but it's the situation NASCAR has put them in. So until they make those kind of orders illegal or make it more competitive if you're not out front, then this is what we're going to see.
And it
And by the
sucks.
way, for the record, I would much rather see NASCAR figure out a rules package or a car package that promotes passing all around and doesn't give a huge lead advantage over telling the teams, now don't have any secret agreements.
I don't think either of those are likely to happen, as we've seen in the past few years.
Unfortunately, you're not wrong. It's just a lot of racing is kind of battling with this. What balancing what the manufacturers want with freedom of design and also parity, and you really can't. Oh, and cost containment too. You can't get all those at once. You really have to decide what's most important. And to be honest, I feel like as great as the money from manufacturers is, their influence is too big. And if anything, they should be the smallest voice. And, NASCAR at one point, really every racing series, NASCAR, IndyCar, Formula One, you could be very competitive. Sports car racing, can be very competitive with an independent package, something that you put together with what you already knew. And I mean, those days are long gone, and I don't see them, quickly coming back. But it just car manufacturers in general have too much power in racing, and it's an issue in Formula One. It's definitely an issue in NASCAR, and it's to an extent it's an issue in IndyCar, but I would say less so than NASCAR and F1. IndyCar wants the positive feedback from GM and from Honda, but if they've got two or three other manufacturers who are interested, they're not going to only listen to what Honda and GM say.
Yeah, that's fair. It's tough because I think Toyota has done a pretty decent job at stepping back a little bit in NASCAR, but it's a problem. I don't see it ever going away, especially in NASCAR because it is very manufacturing based, but we've never seen orders like that, and frankly we haven't seen blocking to the level that it is now. We've always seen it at super speedways on occasion, but we've never seen it week after week, and it's causing the kind of frustration that sees Keselowski take out a guy in practice, and you see a massive accident caused by guys that are just tired of it.
Yeah, and I think a little bit of that is due to in some ways, again, the safer cars. It's been 18 years since a NASCAR driver died in a stock car, and it's really been. It's also been as long since you had a driver end his career with some kind of crippling injury in a stock car. I mean, I know there's been, Jeff Gordon retired after too many back fractures, and Earnhardt Jr. retired after too many concussions, but those were cumulative over time. Those weren't, Jeff Gordon broke his back and he never came back into a car. That was, I'm having difficulty finishing a race in the shape I want to be in, so I'm going to retire at the end of this year.
It should be noted that I thought Ambrose was damn close to that.
Oh, absolutely. Ambrose. And
Oh no, Almirola is what I meant, not Ambrose.
yes, you're right. Almirola I think it was Kansas a year or two ago, a couple years ago. And the other one I'd like to throw in there is, I'd throw in Elliott Sadler when he crashed at Pocono. And I know that he got out of the car, but he got out of the car and immediately fell over, which not really a good thing.
No, not generally.
No. So, and I think, again, some of that relates to the stuff I said about Formula One. The cars are really safe. They're harder to see out of than they used to be because they got higher belt lines, but I wouldn't say that it's not the same extent of Formula One. But the cars are safe. I don't think NASCAR definitely doesn't have an issue with young drivers. If anything, they've got a bunch of veterans and
Tell that college student William Byron.
Okay, fair enough. But yeah, it's sort of the same set of circumstances have led NASCAR to the point that they're at right now. You've got decisions in isolation that all made sense at the time, but you put them all together and you just end up with a just a sticky situation. In this case is, NASCAR doesn't call penalties for blocking. The drivers took advantage of it, and this is what happened. And on the one hand, NASCAR could outlaw blocking, which I would be kind of in favor of. That's pretty normal these days. Or the drivers could get together and say, hey, that was a stupid move on our part. It wrecked a lot of cars. Maybe we should stop doing that.
It's going to be tough. We'll see what the future brings, but just like Austin Dillon tried to block Clint Boyer, it's time to block this podcast because we've been talking for a while about racing.
We have, and I can see that the daylight in Delaware is pretty much gone. It's quickly disappearing here in Kentucky. So thank you all for listening. We're actually going to be going on a break because I was traveling all of last week, and Tom's actually traveling out of the country.
Deutschland.
Yes, off to Germany. And you're going to be there 2 weekends?
2 weeks, and then I've got some personal matters to attend to the weekend after that, so we'll probably be a 3-week hiatus now.
Yeah, so probably won't be coming back until sometime in August. I guess Tom will announce that on his side of the interwebs. So that'll be season 2. So thank you all for watching and listening, et cetera, et cetera. And we'll talk to you guys about a month from now.
Keep on racing.